So it's got a lot of cyber, but does it have the punk? Hello interwebs, I'm here to review a cool little series that came out on Netflix recently, and that is Cyberpunk 2077 Edgerunners. For those of you who haven't heard about what this little show is, it is a 10 episode, from what I know, a limited series, and judging by the end of this show, it seems like it sets it off as this is a hard endpoint for the show. We're not going to do anything after this, but quite possibly they could. Regardless, a 10 episode limited series based on Cyberpunk 2077, the CD Projekt Red game that itself is based on an old tabletop RPG, Cyberpunk. And also, many of you probably have heard of Cyberpunk 2077 because of all the controversy that came out of it based on the fact that it released in a very unfinished state little over a year ago, or somewhere about that. As well as different criticisms about the game as well beyond that point. But most people probably would have heard of the very broken state that this game released in. And I was really curious about this series when I first heard about it for several reasons. One is that while the game itself got a lot of controversy for what I said, rightfully so, because CD Projekt Red should not have released it in the state that it did. I played the game itself and managed to get it to work when it came out on my PS4, shockingly enough, and I didn't have too many problems with it, and I actually ultimately did really enjoy it. I think the game is a really fun game. The world is super interesting. The soundtrack is amazing. I do have issues with it here and there, beyond the bugs with some of its story choices. I don't think it's as punkish as it possibly could have been. I think there's so many ideas that it didn't explore as well as it could have. If any of you actually have seen either Sophie from Mars's excellent analysis of the game or Hello Future Me's excellent analysis of the game as well, both of those videos, while Sophie is more negative and Hello Future Me is slightly more positive, I think they both have a very similar outlook on the game, where it's again, decent ideas, but not really fully developed all the way, and doesn't really push the boundaries of Cyberpunk as much as it could have. But ultimately, I think it's still a generally good game. So when I heard about this show, I became much more interested as well, because Netflix has actually had a really good track record with video game adaptations, especially in animation. They've already worked with CD Projekt Red on the Witcher TV show, and then also the animated movie that they did, both of which I liked. I don't love the Witcher TV show or the animated movie that they did, but I still enjoyed them. I've been positive on both of them. But I did really love their other animated video game adaptations, both Arcane and Castlevania. Not only are those two excellent shows, they are probably, to my mind, two of the best video game adaptations ever done. I'd be hard-pressed to think of anything better. I may be able to think of one or two if I sat for a moment, but those two would definitely be towards the top of my list. So with Cyberpunk Edgerunners coming in as sort of following that legacy, I was really intrigued because I think there's a good base and foundation to build a really interesting story upon. And that also with the fact that I believe the animation studio is fairly well reclaimed. I forget the name of them, but they're fairly well known. And the fact that this is going to be a limited series, so it's going to be telling just sort of a limited story, I think means that there was a lot of opportunity to do some really cool stuff with this. And ultimately, finally getting to my review, now that I'm not in the backstory of it, I do think that they managed to tell a really interesting story that I think kind of falls along the same lines as the game itself, where I think there's some really cool ideas. I think there's some really, really good exploration of a lot of those ideas in some senses, and then there are some things that I found ultimately to be kind of either unexplored or somewhat regressive to the genre of cyberpunk, or at least in the sense that it seems mired in some of the old problems of the cyberpunk genre. Let me start with a lot of the positives that I have on this show. First off, the visuals and the tone of this thing are really unique. While it's not on the level of, let's say, Cowboy Bebop, which would probably be the most immediate comparison I would make in terms of some of the vibe of this show, I think it's kind of going along those lines. It's very stylish. Some of the animation on this is really cool. The whole concept of the series is this kid, David, gets this, he's in a really shitty situation because of his economic class in Cyberpunk. As we know, Night City is this location. He kind of gets this sort of tech upgrade, this sort of, I forget what they're called, but just upgrade on himself. That's so this military grade thing that gives him super speed, essentially. And the visualization of that super speed is really beautiful. It's this rainbow effect that they do. Very cool. Also, they have this glitching out of people's eyes whenever there's sort of a drug-induced or a hallucinogenic state. It's just the vibe is very cool in the visuals. I actually really, really adored them throughout this. The second thing is, I mentioned tone, and I really liked this. While it doesn't necessarily have the same exact tone as Cowboy Bebop. It has this similar like melancholic feel while still kind of this heightened energy to it. Like there's this sort of like sad, like fallen world melancholy feel while still like people trying to live up to this energy of like, yeah, we need to be upbeat and energetic all the time. And this, it really kind of works. Again, it's not as heightened. It doesn't have that jazzy feel that Bebop has, but I think it's ultimately leaning in that direction in a way that I really, really enjoyed. But more so than that, I actually really found the story to be super intriguing. As I already kind of alluded to, this story is ultimately about a lot of different things, most notably on the surface, class, which is very much a cyberpunk type story. We have our main character, David, who, just based on the fact that he doesn't really have anywhere else to turn, has to go into this life of crime, and because of like certain situations, he sort of falls into that because he has no other recourse in his life. And you get to see a lot of like these really cool ideas that cyberpunk should be used for. The fact that like if you don't have insurance in this world, no one's going to help you. Like it's not even that they will help you and they'll get charged out the butt. You will not get helped. And his mom, spoilers for the first episode, she dies. In a really tragic way because he has to use the discount package to save her. And it's really dark and depressing. And I really just love a lot of the ways that they showcase that, especially earlier on in the series, and the way that these things push people into crime. It's very much what cyberpunk should be used for, to showcase the hell of capitalism. But even more than that, that's sort of like the surface level of like every cyberpunk story should have that. But where this one goes deeper, I think, is it starts to layer in like expectations into this story. David is a kid who is under this microscope of expectations from everyone around him. His mom has expectations for him. The guy in charge, Maine, who's the guy in charge of the team that he eventually goes into, has expectations for him. His people around him have expectations of him because of his class. And the show is just all about the pressures of feeling those expectations in a world that will not ever really allow you to live up to any of them. About how David constantly feels this pressure to be something for other people and never for himself. He never gets to be this kid who gets to live a life on his own terms in any way. And I thought that adding that like personal expectation in a world that has also its expectations put upon him and sort of putting him into these boxes, I thought was a really interesting like turn for cyberpunk. You don't really get to see that often in these types of stories, these sort of like personal internal struggles. It's usually more of a person trying to do their best in a really shitty world. And I found that to be a really intriguing little twist on this story. On top of that, I do find some of the side characters to be really interesting. None of them particularly stands out, and there's a few that are clearly meant to like evoke a Cowboy Bebop-esque sort of characters. Like we have the manic like kid who just like constantly says like funny things and is very over the top and violent. But I do find them all to be relatively interesting, if not as deep as others. And so I think that that all works, but also some other stuff too, like body horror is a really big part of this. Like you don't really think about cyberpunk too much in terms of body horror. Like it's not something that I immediately think of, but it is sort of an obvious connection to make with like people modifying their bodies and changing it. And that really just gets even further drawn out with like there's some really horrific body horror within this. In that sort of like manipulation of the body. And there's also these themes of addiction as well, of being addicted to body modification, I found to be quite intriguing. So all of that I think is really good. And so for all of that, if any of that I've already said intrigues you, I would highly recommend this show. However, I do want to end on a couple negatives, some things that I found kind of similar to the game itself that I think the show just did not think through or evolve enough, and I think that it should have been pushed upon a little bit more, or at least given a nod to. And I think the biggest thing that I'm going to point to is just the way women are treated. I'm blanking, because I'm doing this off the top of my head, I'm blanking on the main female lead of the show. She is an interesting character and has an interesting relationship to David. But visually, she is treated as a character who's like, look at the hot, sexy lady. There are several moments throughout the entire series where we get to see naked women and boobs and just like, oh, look at hot women sort of thing. And that's not necessarily a problem in and of itself. Many, including Cyberpunk 2077, the game itself, like Cyberpunk stories do discuss like look at how we've commodified sex and like heightened this idea of sex in a very capitalistic world, this sort of like desirability, and sex workers also being a big part of that, is one of the things about Cyberpunk 2077 that I found not always unproblematic. I think they did have problematic depictions of sex workers in the game, but the game was more sympathetic towards sex workers than I've ever really seen in a lot of other video games before it. So again, there's a lot to analyze with that, but I do think that that is ultimately a positive on the game, or at least a not totally negative thing. But here in this show, it doesn't really explore that in any nuanced way. Like, I think this show has a lot of ideas about addiction and body modification and body horror, and things in here, and yet they just present women being pretty as simply that. Like, look at the hot, sexy, naked lady, and just like kind of titillate with that. And I found that like that's such a missed opportunity. I'm not saying you can't show naked women or that you shouldn't, but in a very cyberpunk world, like, what does it mean that women want to be aesthetically pretty in this world? What does aesthetically pretty mean in this world? Like, to be hot, like when you can modify your body in any way, shape, or form, like David does at many points throughout this, to get himself buff and stuff like that. What would it mean for a woman to be naturally what is quote unquote seen as stereotypically sexy, or wanting to modify herself to be quote unquote stereotypically sexy? What does stereotypically sexy mean in this world nowadays when people can be like full up of metal? There's so many interesting questions that you could go into that. Now the show really doesn't. It's just like, look at hot sexy lady. And I found that to be really kind of a disappointing avenue, considering that a lot of the themes of the show bump up against ideas that they could have expressed also too through female characters. But ultimately the show seems very disinterested in the women. They're there as the trophy and damsel in distress for the male character. It's a trope that we've seen throughout all of fiction, where it's like, oh, look at the hot sexy lady who motivates the main character because he sees her as like someone to protect, or someone to take care of, or someone to save. And it's ultimately kind of a disappointing trope, especially considering there were so many good ideas they could have done with that. Especially since her character, too, is also someone dealing with expectations. Minor spoilers here, but her backstory kind of gets tied up into Arasaka and what Arasaka is doing, which itself is about like the expectations of the past being put upon the company as a whole now, and then putting upon her, and how that damages her because of who she's expected to be. And I'll leave it there because I think there's more you could analyze with that, but that's sort of just the surface level reading of it without spoiling too much. And so I think there's so many cool ideas that you could have delved into with her, and they don't. And that ultimately leaves me a bit disappointed on that end. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I generally am positive on Cyberpunk Edgerunners. I think that it's definitely not reaching the heights of something like Castlevania, and definitely not Arcane, but I do think there's enough kernels of really good ideas, enough stylish stuff in here, a unique tone. David is a very well explored character, if the women necessarily aren't. I think this is a positive show that I have caveats to, but one that I found to be particularly intriguing and worth my time if you can get past some of the ways that women are seen, which is not bad. It's not like it's like super sexist. It's just tropey and not as fleshed out as it could have been. And has women in sort of that stereotypical, like, save the damsel place. Not overly offensive, just disappointing, I guess. So with that said, I think I'm generally very positive on this show. I would recommend it to you, again, if you can get past those caveats that I said. But yeah, I found it to be interesting. But what did you think of Cyberpunk Edgerunners? Did you find it interesting? Did you like it? Did you hate it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond all that, thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.